World War trade is on, and the planet may never be the same. Donald Trump fired the first shot, but is he ready for this fight? With China's president on a regional tour of Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, it looks like we're in the coalition-building phase of a conflict that's sure to upend supply chains and rewrite the rules of globalization as they have stood ever since Beijing entered the World Trade Organization back in 2001. To win a war, even a trade war, you need strength and resilience, not just from the foot soldiers in the trenches of trading floors, factory warehouses, and boardrooms, but from the civilians back home. Who of China and the United States has a more resilient population, one with the resolve and the skills to adapt in a crisis and make the right choices? And what say third parties? Do they pick a side? The current model of globalization depends on free movement of goods, services, people, and ideas. Is innovation possible if all the planet's superpowers opt for top-down models where autocrats and oligarchs rule? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what some say is the West's pain and China's gain. Well, with us from the Italian capital, Nancy Qian, professor of economics at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, co-director of the Global Poverty Research Lab there, and currently visiting professor at Rome's Ente Enodi Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Jean-Louis Rocaz, director of the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po's Dealing with a Resurgent China Research Consortium. You're shaking your head. Is that not what you do?
You know, I'm more professor at Sciences Po, you know.
Professor.
That's my,
Okay.
my official title.
I thought I would cut to the most prestigious. But...
No, maybe, I don't know. No, Research on China, it's a good title as well.
Jean-François Di Meglio, president of the Asia Center think tank. How are you?
Hi.
And we welcome back economist and consultant Jean-Paul Cheng. How are you?
Okay, thank you for inviting.
You can, by the way, listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. First question, what's going to happen to Barbie? Dateline Gijon, Spain. Barbie doll collector and TikTok influencer Mystic predicts we may all soon pay 20% more for that ubiquitous consumer icon, a doll whose production goes from China to the U.S. before the rest of the world.
The United States has never manufactured the Barbie doll in its own country. It has always outsourced it due to costs. We do not know if they're going to assume these costs by lowering quality, but we are going that way. They already do final details in the United States, and I believe that they will increasingly go towards this line of work to have their production, or at least 70–80% of their production, in their country.
So Nancy Qian, what is going to happen to the Barbie doll?
I'm glad you're asking me that, because just today I was talking to my 6-year-old about what tariffs are. My daughter, actually, she just turned 7. And to explain it to her, I explained it in the context of dolls and Barbies in particular, because, you know, of the very famous movie. And what I was explaining to her was that a tariff is a tax that goes on the Barbie when it crosses the border into the United States. And because a lot of the components of the Barbie are made in other countries, if the US president wants to increase the tax, the tariff on the Barbie, then it's going to cost us more to get her a Barbie, and she might not get a Barbie.
And who feels the pain the most here?
My 6-year-old, I think, and her parents, who feel really bad because they can't get her a Barbie. No, I'm just kidding. I don't really want to give my daughter a Barbie. No, in all seriousness, American consumers will feel the pain. So we have a lot of studies, well, I should say one very well-known study from the first Trump trade war that studied what happened to the cost when the U.S. increased tariffs on imports from China. And what they found was that American importers bore almost the entire burden of the cost, almost 100%, because at that time, it wasn't clear whether the tariffs would be permanent or temporary, so they took the cost and tried not to pass it on to the consumers. Of course, if it lasts a long time, at some point, it has to go to the consumers. And what we've seen this time is that American importers do not want to take on that cost. partly because the tariffs are so extraordinarily high, and partly because the US president has said that these tariffs are going to last for a while. So already they're trying to pass it on to the Chinese exporters and the American consumers.
Jean-François Di Meglio, what about here in Europe? Again, the Barbie doll is a good example because it's manufactured in China, then they finish the product in the United States before it comes here to Europe. So are we feeling the pain too?
Mind you, tomorrow Mr. Trump might say that he will just alleviate the duties on Barbie, just like he did on the iPhones. You know, it might change. So with a plea like the one we just heard, maybe he will change his mind.
Jean-Louis Rocca?
Yes, probably for the time. You know, we had a very interesting 2 days of discussion about, you know, China and the rest of the world. But China, you know, domestic problems as well, the impact of the decision of Trump on the domestic China, as we say, you know, and the Chinese people. And, you know, we were all, you know, in a situation where it's very difficult to know exactly what would be happening, you know, in the near future for the moment, because as Jean-François says, it's very difficult because, you know, at any moment he can change of mind. And it is, of course, in probably the first time in the history of the world that one person can change the situation just like that, you know, and to deny what he said previously, you know, that very difficult to know exactly the impact, you know, in details.
All right, so a whim of the U.S. president is what's worrying a lot of Europeans. And as you say, this is also a problem for China, for all the nationalist pride displayed on Chinese social media the last 2 weeks. Real-world entrepreneurs are worried. At the Canton Trade Fair, the marketing manager of medical equipment exporter Conmo Electronic Company finds herself staring at, well, as Jean-François was saying, an uncertain future.
Right now, it's not just a matter of changing tracks. It's a matter of life or death. Around 70% of our business is from American clients, so the pressure we're under is extremely high.
So for that entrepreneur, it's a matter of life or death, Jean-Paul Chang. A lot of small businesses are going to be impacted in China.
Yeah, if the increase of tariff is maintained, that's the point. Because right now, at the announced rate of 145% of tax, it's so unrealistic that the only reaction from entrepreneurs is to stop producing, you know, because you are not taking the risk to have
15% of China's exports go to the United States.
13.8. Yeah, you're right. I mean,
close to 15.
Like
all right.
Yeah.
I'm rounding it up.
Yeah,
Can they? What do they do with those 15% or those 13.8%, as you put it?
Again, if these tariffs are definitively enforced, that means recession for some industrial units, loss of job, difficulties. It's true, but everybody is actually expecting some kind of negotiation to come because you can notice that on both sides, okay, the word negotiation still exists. Mr. Trump is saying, I'm waiting a call from Mr. Xi Jinping. Why he's not calling me? I know that he wants to negotiate. But he has to call me. On the Chinese side, they published the document called the Livre Blanc, the white book.
White paper, yeah.
White paper, stating all the problems between the United States and the white paper finished on, we are open to negotiations. So as long as the negotiation word does not disappear from the official speech on both sides, everybody actually is expecting some kind of. Otherwise, it means real difficulties for Chinese export, some of the Chinese export firms, and of course for the American importers and customers.
So, Nancy Kian, listening to Jean-Paul Chang and to what I said at the outset about we're into a trade war, according to everything that's been stated, is that overstating it? Is it a trade war yet?
Oh, this is a trade war. I mean, the only reason that there's any question about whether it's a trade war is because it started so quickly and escalated so quickly. But this is definitely a trade war, and probably the fastest and most rapidly escalating one in history. Already, firms are canceling contracts. Exporters in China are canceling contracts with their American importers. Partners that have been working together for 20, 30 years are calling each other saying, hey guys, can you take a bit of the tariff cost? No, can you? And they just realize that they can't take it, so they just have to stop trading for now. I mean, hopefully it's just for now.
All right, at the top of the list, and Jean-François Di Meglio mentioned it, of those caught in the crossfire of this trade war, there's Apple, the world's largest company by market capitalization. It's lost nearly 20% of its value since the start of the year. Nancy Qian, the Apple's rise, I guess a symbol of globalization as it is these days. Is it headed for a fall? What are your thoughts on if you're decoupling, if people are starting to pull their investments from each other's markets? What does that mean for a company like Apple?
So the situation is pretty complicated for Apple. But thankfully, I don't know if we should say it's good or it's bad, but this is the second trade war. Apple's already gone through this once. And what it's doing now, it's the same thing as what it did last time. On the one hand, it's pledging to increase investment in the US. On the other hand, it's trying to lobby the US government, in this case, President Donald Trump, to make exemptions for Apple, which it has so far. So I think the big question for Apple is, will these exemptions last? Or will the president take them away all of a sudden? And I think that uncertainty makes it very difficult for Apple to do business. I'll actually go ahead and say that the hardest thing for business, it's not the tariffs per se. It's not the difficulty is not coming from the fact that the US wants to impose tariffs. The biggest difficulty is the chaos, how sudden they're introduced, how high they are, how suddenly they're taken away, and then how suddenly the government makes an announcement that they might come back. That's really the biggest difficulty for business leaders right now.
Which brings us back to what you were saying earlier, Jean-François Di Meglio, when you said, oh, well, it could all be reversed in one day. Well, yes and no, right?
Well, the gesture can be unwound and can be reversed overnight. But what has changed, and your question was, is it the beginning of a new world? What has changed is probably the awareness of the general public, general audience, about how dependent this global order was from the understanding of two big major players, China and US.
Yeah, China has the manufacturing, the US has the financial services and the tech.
The people's eyes are open. We spoke about trade war. And then probably what comes after is also the various aspects of this war or conflict which may happen. Trade is very important, especially for Trump's voters. Trade is very important, but behind the so-called trade war, you have the tech war, and you have other key questions which are rising. Monetary war. Because what is at stake, look at what happened. Why did Trump release the duties on iPhones, for example? Because there was a threat on US treasuries, on the US monetary market, on US bond market. And behind this trade war, you can see all the potential wars which can happen. This is a test. And either party is testing the other on this field. But on other fields, you have not tested yet the other party. And it may happen one day. So yes, it's a different world.
Let me ask you, Jean-Louis Roca. China has capital controls on its currency. The United States does not. So
yeah, I think...
Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? Who's got the upper edge?
I think there is something very important, I think, to make a difference between the point of view of businessmen, of Chinese businessmen for this point of view, and the point of view of people who are trying to think about the near future of China. Just to give you an example, there were a lot of intellectuals and scholars in China very close to the authorities, people like Zhang Weiwei, for example, who from the start, before the election of Trump, they said, okay, it's a good news to have Trump, you know. Why? Because that will be probably a mess in the US and maybe a mess as well in the world, and maybe we could gain something precisely, you know, from that. And now some people, a lot of people, once again, you know, scholars or, you know, people very close to the authorities consider that maybe it's a good deal to a certain extent because, for example, there could be something that could help China to achieve the big, I would say, the big dream of China from an economic point of view, an economic model, to shift from an economy based on exportation and investment to an economy based on consumption and domestic production to a certain extent, to be precisely not dependent from the outside world, you know, to the rest. Then, you know,
but we've been hearing that for a long time, haven't we?
Yeah,
just like
exactly.
We've been hearing for a long time, the global supply chains rely too much on China for manufacturing. But what has really changed?
And for the time being, that the big problem of the Chinese economy, that this shift is not achieved at all, you know. But once again, some people say, okay, maybe by changing, you know, more and more, you know, and there is a difference with the last war trade with the US. Now we are quite in a good situation to resist and to change things and maybe to have more influence on the world.
I think this is wishful thinking by some. I would not challenge the fact that yes, intellectuals like this idea of China having a free ride, maybe, from the chaos. Yet, if we take some examples of what we can see now, I wouldn't say, of course, that Xi Jinping is hopeless by taking this trip to Southeast Asia. But the fact that he's going to Southeast Asia definitely means that he needs France. And my analysis is that first, Chinese leaders prefer stability because this is when the world is stable that China rises first. So stability first. And second, there is a lot of questioning in Chinese minds currently. You know, we were talking with some people at the embassy last week, and they were asking to us so many questions, us Europeans, as if, contrary to what your question was hinting, the Europeans would have the answers and not the questions. That was very interesting. They were seeking answers from Europeans, so they need answers.
Jean-Paul Chang, just want to follow up on Jean-Louis' point here.
Yep.
Are the Chinese going to buy more Barbie dolls?
China has increased the size of importation anyway, I mean, everywhere.
But even their consumption, I mean, domestic consumption as opposed to, it's the same argument we're having here in Europe with Germany, right? Can Germany switch from being an export-driven economy to more of a consumer-driven economy?
They are importing consumer goods because they are holding importation fair every year in China. I invite France, UK as main guest each year to show the consumer products for the Chinese market. Okay, so they are doing some efforts. So the increase of the Chinese importation globally increased. Vis-à-vis the United States, actually, China decreased in absolute number. Also, in the relative part of the U.S., the U.S. Trade deficit, Chinese goods represented something like 47% of the U.S. trade deficit 5 years ago. Now represents something like 1/4, 24% or something like that. So somehow, I don't use I don't consider the war is declared and it's for sure, because still I insist that at that level of verbally announced tariff rate, it means we stop. Nobody can do anything with that seriously, okay? Or you are creating really a recessionist threat for everybody.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question then. Are the Chinese preparing for that eventuality? I asked the question because we saw, and Jean-François Dimegler was mentioning it earlier, last week, swings in U.S. government-issued bonds for the first time raised global doubts about the United States as a safe haven in times of crises. For years, the Chinese have bought into that. They own huge amounts of U.S. debt. But they've also, as you can see from this chart dating back to 2001, they've been quietly selling off their positions in the U.S. bond market. So is that part of preparation for the eventuality that this 145% tariffs is for real?
Yeah, it's linked to something Jean-François said. Behind the trade war, there are other things. Okay, so as far as the T-bonds, T-notes, T-bills held by the Chinese side, it decreased from above the 1,000 billion to 759 at the end of last year. So they've been retreating progressively, but not aggressively, because if you're selling the bonds, you're shooting in your own foot, because you're still holding the paper. If you're selling, the price it's going down. So it's dangerous game. It's not. There's no winner. Just like in the trade war. But what I'm saying is behind this conflict right now, it shows that our Chinese side prepare for the return of Mr. Trump to power. They've been a first shock in 2018 with the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. They came to an agreement on January 2020. Of course, both sides didn't keep their word because of the COVID exception, etc. But they've been preparing. So they've been diversifying their export market to other area of the world. That's the first thing. They decreased the holding of the U.S. Treasury papers, and they increased the level and the quality of their products. Also, to avoid to be strangled by the.
Okay, so preparing for all of this, Nancy Khan, that brings us to, I guess, to the central question of all this, which is we've been hearing since COVID began here in Europe about decoupling and de-risking. Now, with what was launched 2 weeks ago from the White House, are we into a new era of globalization, one where the supply chains will be completely different?
It's new and not new. It's new in that I think the tensions are higher, the tariffs are higher, the pressure's higher. It's not new in the sense that, these stresses, this idea of decoupling was raised 8 years ago. So I think what we're going to see is things shifting around. So after 2018, we saw that the Chinese imports or exports were diverting to to Vietnam, to Mexico before they came to the U.S. I think this time, what we're seeing is that the U.S. is trying to shut down those intermediary channels so that China can't do that. But will it be successful in shutting down those channels? I think it won't be 100% successful. So, Mexico completely relies on China, so it has a lot of power with Mexico. Mexico's already offered to raise import tariffs on China. But Vietnam relies just as much on China as it does on the U.S. And Vietnam is, right next to China and far, far away from the U.S. So it's not obvious at all that the U.S. has a leverage to get the Vietnamese to totally shut their borders to Chinese imports.
Let me ask you about this
then. Shift, but not a total change.
Not a total change. And after Vietnam, before Cambodia, Xi Jinping currently in Malaysia. He was welcomed earlier at the airport by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. The question for you is, Nancy Khan, is the Chinese would like a free trade agreement with Southeast Asian nations, with ASEAN. Malaysia currently holds the rotating presidency of ASEAN. Is it possible? Is that something that's in the cards?
But there is one. The Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership that was initiated 3 years ago.
Nancy Khan, they want a full-blown trade agreement, like complete.
I think right now everything is on the table, in the sense that, for better or for worse. So NAFTA had a free trade agreement. Why shouldn't ASEAN? But then on the other hand, we're seeing free trade agreements come and go. So there's also going to be a lot of suspicion about how long-lasting or stable these free trade agreements are. And of course, it's not just about trade, is it? There's also a lot of geopolitics, a lot of political issues at stake. And all of those things will have to be ironed out amongst the numerous countries in ASEAN before they can really move forward. So I would say everything's possible and nothing is simple.
Everything possible, nothing simple. And yeah, we mentioned the fact that there's been those tariffs slapped by Donald Trump. Malaysia, it's 24%. Vietnam is 46, if I'm not wrong, 46% tariffs. And, 2 weeks before the 50th anniversary of the departure of the last U.S. troops from Vietnam, Xi Jinping went and laid a wreath at the Hanoi Mausoleum for Vietnamese father of independence, Ho Chi Minh. He then would go on to talk up a common revolutionary heritage.
Over the past 75 years, no matter how the international situation has changed, the two sides have supported each other in their struggle for national independence and liberation, joined hands in the cause of socialist construction, and forged ahead in their respective modernization processes, setting an example of solidarity and cooperation among socialist countries. In the face of the current changing and turbulent international situation, China and Vietnam adhere to peace and development and deepen friendly cooperation, which brings precious stability and certainty to the world.
Precious stability and certainty to the world. Jean-Paul Cheng, when he talks about common socialist values, of course, it skims over the fact that China and Vietnam had a war in 1979, but that's a long time ago. Tell us about those common socialist values in today's world. What does that mean?
Grosso modo, I would say they have the same political system. One party ruling regime and some common history of revolutionary past. So it's easy to make a call to all this common past of solidarity. It's true that China has been supporting Vietnam during a long time, 30 years maybe, between 1949 and 1979. Also it's a way it's an unspoken message to the American. We Chinese, we have our neighboring countries' diplomacy. We respect our neighbors. Unlike you, in view of your attitude vis-à-vis Canada or Mexico, you're so brutal. You see, we are civilized. We are consolidating our relation with our neighbor country. That's something, kind of message for the rest of the world as well.
Jean-François Di Meglio?
Yes, you have the same rift, Vietnam, China, as you have with China, Korea, Japan. You have, on the one hand, on the political side, you still have some unresolved issues. Yes, of course, those parties are twin parties, and they were brought in same education and same communist culture. Yet, China and Vietnam do have some border issues, and especially in the South China Sea. By the same token, you have Korea, Japan, and China having issues, and yet they started talking about trade again last week. So you have two fronts. And if there is a rift in this new world, it's probably a rift between political issues, political camps, if there are anything like camps, and business issues. So indeed, China and Vietnam have lots of business communalities. ASEAN and China had together more trade last year than China has with US.
And Vietnam,
China
part of this
Europe.
China plus one policy, right? You make some of the
Yeah,
stuff in
yeah,
China, then
yeah.
and then it's
To
sent
me,
on to
yeah.
Vietnam before.
To me, the reason why the US administration in the first place, now it's over, in the first place, why did they set so high a tax level on Vietnam? This is one, because Vietnam is, of course, subcontracting for China, definitely. And two, you may see Vietnam with this common history as China 2.0 in the years 2030 or 2040. So they want really probably to hit Vietnam before it becomes a new China 10 or 20 years down the road.
So Jean-Louis Roca, again, for our viewers around the globe here, are we headed towards a world where there's like little circles of trade, of commerce, or is globalization going to remain global as it is now, just with different actors making different stuff?
Difficult to say, but just to add some words about what Jean-François said, that we have to think about the political consequences of this change in the trade organization, as we say, to a certain extent. And another very important element is, of course, the relations with China and Taiwan, or mainland China and Republic of China, depending on the views about that. That could have also consequences on that, and on that we don't know exactly, because we are talking here about businessmen, but we have to talk maybe as well about people as well, because China is people in China now, in the time being, are very worried about the situation. As now you have a middle class in China, a middle class with a lot of problems for the time being, and the consequences of what we see for the time being, on the Chinese society could be very, very, very hard. Not only in terms of businessmen who have to shut down their enterprises, but also the fact that now employment, and specifically the employment of young people in China, is a very bad situation. A lot of young people, it's impossible to get jobs, etc., etc. And, at the consequence, you could imagine, for example, the fact that because, we have a lot of problems in the Chinese society, you can have a more aggressive attitude of mainland China against Taiwan, etc., etc. I'm sure that, Trump administration have absolutely not a clue about the political and the consequences of that on the security of the region. That's
So,
also very dangerous, for the world.
Jean-Paul Cheng, economic disruption all around could lead to a rally round the flag moment in China?
Yeah. I mean, but it will not really happen, I believe, because as Jean-François mentioned, the Asian countries are quite integrated right now with China. It's the biggest trade partner with China. And you have to know that all the Asian countries, the ASEAN countries, are in excess of exportation vis-à-vis China. So China has been establishing a very strong link economically.
So the idea is you can't go to war in an interdependent world?
I believe that will. But about the Taiwan stuff, okay, I will say that all this is just a show, because when the Chinese are responding, when the US said 25%, they replied 25%, 50%, 50%, etc. Okay, it's a way to show that they are not submitting to any diktat from the American relating to the core interest of China, and they consider the trade is part of the core interest. That means that they are, without saying it, they say that on all the core interest problems, we will not accept a position imposed by the United States, including, of course, the problem of Taiwan. So it's a kind of a coherence in the behavior of the Chinese government. But the reality, everybody knows that. You have to to remember the recent reactions from the Chinese side is this increase of tariff day after day, 25 after 50, and etc. It's becoming a senseless, meaningless game of number, and it's ridiculous. That means they don't want to participate in this escalation of. They want to negotiate. Somehow I feel that they want to negotiate, but they have difficulties to negotiate.
So Nancy Kian, Jean-Paul here, seeing the glass half full. Is that your view?
I think your question is there a rally around the flag moment? How much domestic support does Xi Jinping and the Chinese government have if they go to a long, painful trade war? And I think this is a really interesting moment, because what the Trump administration is betting on is that because the Chinese economy has really slowed down, and because of all the domestic economic problems that China has been facing, this might be a really good moment to hit them with tariffs that really hurt their economy. So they hurt a little bit more because they can't take it right now. But there's also a psychological effect. You can also view this, what the Trump government is doing, as a political gift to the Chinese government. A lot of the earlier crises, the people can blame on their own leaders, at least partly. But this one, they're seeing in international news and in Chinese news, this is really started by the American government. So this is a moment, I think, of solidarity amongst the Chinese people. No one is happy about this. Nobody wanted this trade war. But there's really a feeling in China that America wanted to start a trade war with China, and China will just have to endure it. So I think Xi Jinping will have more domestic support for this than the Americans counted on.
Let me ask you, Nancy, because back in February, this was before Trump launched his tariff offensive, Xi Jinping hosted a conference where he told captains of industry to show their talent. Among those present, we saw Alibaba co-founder Jack Ma apparently back in favor after abruptly disappearing from the public eye in 2020 when he criticized China's financial sector. Your thoughts? There was also in the room the likes of the bosses of Huawei, of DeepSeek. You have these tech titans who are front and center. Are China and the United States different or similar in that these giants of techs, critics would call them oligarchs, exist in both countries?
All economies are similar in the sense that the governments have to work with the economy and the industry leaders. What's really remarkable and interesting about recent events is that we haven't really seen such a flagrant flaunting of this relationship in a liberal democracy in a while. The fact that all the tech giants were at the White House inauguration, and even more so, the role that Elon Musk has played since Trump has become president, that's just unheard of. And I don't think we're going to see anything like that in China. In China, Beijing, the government, they want to keep control. That's the entire reason why they wanted to avoid the oligarch situation that plagued Russia for decades. So I think right now they're trying to bring back the industry into government to have a collaborative relationship, but they're really not going to let business take charge.
Not going to let business take charge? Jean-Louis Rocard, we're living in an age of oligarchs, whether it's the United States, China, or Russia.
I would like just to add something about, Nancy Tian said about, the situation in China, as we say, and that to a certain extent that Trump gave a gift to the government, because precisely now in China, for the time being, I'm talking about the people. They have a reaction that is very close to the reaction of European people in general. The fact that for a lot of people, they are really shocked, by the way Trump is deciding things and changing things. And there is sort of nationalistic attitude to that. At the same time, they are also trying to making jokes about, there are a lot of jokes in China about, Trump and he is really stupid, etc., etc. And at the same time, they are worried about that. But effectively, when you are worried, and there is a lot of problems. Before the decision of Trump, there was always already a crisis, social crisis, mainly in the middle class in China about the future. They were really worried, and it's something more, about that. And to a certain extent, the only way for people is saying, okay, we have a government. Maybe it's not the perfect government, but at last we have, something, which can protect us, and that's true. That anyway, if we want the change in terms of politics in China, it's not the good moment for that.
Jean-François Di Meglio, your thoughts on this and the malaise on both in China and the United States among ordinary citizens?
I think both countries are on very, very opposite trajectories. We may say what we say about the Chinese regime, and a lot can be said, yet in that period of time, what has been successful is the nation building. There has been a real nation building, whatever we can say. So at the end of the day, when you see those corporate bosses,
including
at the
Jack Ma,
yes, of course, they may challenge the Communist Party sometimes, but they know the limit. Well, that's one. And second, they know they belong. At the end of the day, they know they belong. What's happening in the US, from what we can see from afar, is that the nation building did take place some time ago, but what Trump administration is definitely doing, and this is once again, it's a fact, is creating a rift within the US society. So you have two opposite ways of running a country. One is really putting people together, and whatever Trump says is not necessarily putting all these people together. So that's a big difference.
Nancy Kian, is there an unwinding in the United States?
Well, I'm a perennial optimist, so I don't like to think of it as an unwinding. I like to think of it as a learning process, an evolution. So, every country goes through good moments and bad moments. I would say that this is a bad moment in the sense that, if you've been paying attention to American politics, it's not just trade, right, and tariffs that's kind of in chaos. A lot of things, I would say even more domestic policies are in chaos. This is just a moment, I think, where the Trump administration has decided to take the established order. They're trying to push the boundaries as far as they can. They're doing it with his particular personality, so it's full of chaos. And then at the end of this, in the short run, it looks like unwinding, but I'm hopeful that in the medium and long run, we're going to learn from this and understand how we need to improve our institutions and probably, how we improve our society.
Jean-Paul Cheng?
Yeah, I cannot judge what's going on inside the United States, but the one thing is very obvious is that we don't know exactly what the precise target of the American move on the tariff, on the trade, because you cannot consider the relation between China and the United States only from the point of view of the trade balance. You have to think from the payment balance point of view. That means investment, service, etc. Or in terms of investment, for instance, you have to know that the American multinational, established in China, producing and selling in China, that represents something like $490 billion US. And this is not concerned right now by the tariff at all, and so the relations are actually not so simple. It's deeply interdependent. You have also the service. U.S. is in excess of exporting of service vis-à-vis China
And Europe.
And Europe, yeah, and via China. So if you add the excess of service plus all what the American firms are selling in China, and you compare to the trade deficit, actually the relation is quite balanced. Nobody dare to say that today because, everybody is talking about the trade war. But the reality is they have a lot of subjects to be negotiated, to be discussed, to come to a common measurement of this kind of a relation between the two superpowers. So that's why, personally, I'm in spite of the internal factor in both countries. Okay, in China, I believe that as far as the present show we are assisting, I believe it's maybe a little bit overplayed. So.
All right. Well, Nancy Kian described it as a learning experience. Yeah. We'll take that positive note with us as we say thank you for joining us from Rome. I want to thank as well Jean-François Di Meglio, Jean-Louis Rocca, Jean-Paul Chang. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.